The Rebel Capitalist Show. All right, guys, it gives me a great deal of pleasure to welcome someone to the Rebel Capitalist Show that I have really looked forward to speaking with. And I know all of my listeners and viewers have really looked forward to hearing from this gentleman as well. He really needs no introduction. He is Professor Richard Werner. Professor, thank you for being on the Rebel Capitalist Show.
Thank you for having me. It's a pleasure to be on your show and to talk to you.
All right. So most of my viewers are going to know your backstory. So I really want to dive into the meat of the conversation. And they also, well, hopefully they realize that you really invented the term or phrase quantitative easing way, way, way back in the day. So, and you did so to describe what the Bank of Japan was doing or trying to do with the Japanese economy after they went through the big stock market bust and the real estate crash in 1990, going into the early 1990s. So could you describe or tell us why or how you came up with that term, why it's descriptive, and why the Japanese quantitative easing may differ from what we've seen in the United States and with the ECB?
Yes. Well, thank you very much. So this was over a quarter century ago. I was in Tokyo, chief economist of Jardine Fleming Securities Asia in Tokyo, British investment bank, which later became part of JP Morgan. And I had already, when I arrived there with them in early 1994, pointed out that there's a big problem, because this goes back to my earlier forecast on Japan, which was back in 1991, published back at Oxford, where I had been doing my doctorate. There's a discussion paper, Oxford Institute of Economics and Statistics, University of Oxford, that I put out in October 1991. And you have to remember, in 91, this sort of set the scene. People were still in the mood of the 80s and, Japanese money flooding the world, and Japan, the Japanese century. And
they're saying buy the dip.
Yeah. And well, 89 was, of course, the peak of the stock market. And so 1991, the stock market had already fallen, but the economy was still going strong at 7% GDP growth. And clearly was very strong. So, what's the problem? Buy the dip. Exactly. Buy those really attractive Japanese stocks. They've come down, but clearly, Japan is going to power ahead, particularly since in 91, the Bank of Japan lowered interest rates for the first time. The magic variable that everyone is watching, interest rates. So all the global asset allocators and, investment strategists were saying, well, buy Japanese stocks, really pile in now. They've just started a cycle of interest rate reductions and the economy is so strong. That's when I put out my paper back at Oxford, October 91, and I came to very different conclusions. Namely, Japanese banks are likely to go bankrupt, despite the fact that the world's top 20 banks were Japanese, measured by assets, They're going to go bankrupt, and Japan is likely to move into the biggest recession since the Great Depression. So sell Japanese stocks. Right. I myself got a put option on the Nikkei at the time when I put this out in 91. And that was the background. So I was pretty bearish on Japan. And by the time I arrived as chief economist at Jardine Fleming Securities, I was more interested in the question of how we're going to get out of the mess that is going to unfold. And I had no doubts that the mess was going to unfold. And so I placed more emphasis on that question, which was a bit ahead of its time because everyone else was still thinking, actually it's not so bad and it's going to recover, slightly delayed, maybe the stock market recovery, but, it's still a strong economy. What's the problem? And to me, it was clear that the banking system was going to freeze up, and therefore the right monetary policy was going to be key. The right central bank action was going to be key.
At this time, Richard, had the BOJ done anything other than lower rates?
No, just
They
lowering
hadn't
rates.
expanded their balance sheet at this time.
No, just lowering rates, which, to most analysts and economists seem to be the most important thing to do. But I came out arguing that lowering rates, and they were around 5% by that time, was not going to help. You can lower them to 0. I was trying to be dramatic, and it's not going to help. Little did I think the Bank of Japan was going to try to work hard to prove me right on that one. I mean, they could have skipped that one. And so I was proposing policies to get out of a massive banking freeze up that was going to derail the economy and was going to create a Great Depression. Now, because monetary policy was key, and I was going to talk about stimulatory monetary policy, I realized that the moment I just mentioned that much on a very high level, the misunderstandings would start, because, monetary policy, you mean more interest rate reductions? Everyone would think that. No, it's not about the price of money. It's not about the interest rates.
Right.
So you had to get people away from that as the first thing you say. And that's why quantitative had to be, the first word when introducing my proposal. But then that wasn't enough. If you just say, no, it's the quantity of money, the quantity of the right type of money, the right type of the money supply. Money supply. Oh, yes, we know that. M1, M2, M3, you're a monetarist. All right, that's what it's all about. No, that's not what it's about, because the trouble is that these standard monetarist money aggregates, money supply aggregates, M1, M2, M3, which central banks publish. Well, sometimes they stop publishing them.
Yeah, right.
But they used to publish them anyway. That's not really the most interesting variable on the quantity side either. So even that would create misunderstandings. And that's why I realized you'd need a new expression, because I'm talking about something else, namely the quantity of credit creation. And if you want to be more precise, for GDP growth, you need to look at the quantity of credit creation used for GDP transactions.
Right.
And actually, all this came out when I was asked by the Nikkei, the Nihon Keizai Shimbun, the leading Japanese newspaper, which is a financial newspaper daily, which now owns the Financial Times as well, abbreviated Nikkei, hence the Nikkei index is like the FTSE index, from Financial Times. And so the Nikkei asked me to produce an article on my proposals. And I actually initially was going to have a headline saying, well, we need an expansion in credit creation, which in Japanese is shinyo sozo. But at the time was an expression that just people didn't know. And the editor came back to me and said, well, okay, your article is great, but headlines, we reserve the right anyway to write the headlines. And in Japan, they're quite good. They want the author to be on board. They don't just give you a headline as they do in English language publications. But they were saying, can we have something else? That because shinyo also, credit creation, you readers just will have no idea. I was trying to say, well, makes them, interested. They can read what it is in my article. But they insisted, no, it's something else that sort of intuitively, just looking at the headline, will give them an idea. And that's when quantitative easing was born. Because in the Japanese language, all this is in Japanese, by the way, I should add. The article was in Japanese, and my presentation is Tokyo, of course, in Japanese, and negotiating with the editor is in Japanese. We're talking about Japanese words. And so the standard Japanese expression for stimulatory or expansionary monetary policy is literally translated, means easing, kanwa seisaku. And that's where the easing comes from. It's a literal translation of the Japanese expression. And so I use that standard expression for easing, which means expansionary monetary policy, and added the quantitative prefix for, in order to give people the right idea that it's not going to be about the price of money. And as a result, you've got a new expression that is different from what they use for money supply. M1, M2, and 3, they use a completely different expression. In fact, they use the English words money supply, money supply in Japanese, And so it wasn't that either. And therefore, it was a new expression that made clear, okay, it's not the price of money, it's not interest rates. It is an expansionary monetary policy, but it's kind of And it's the quantity, but it's kind of different because we haven't used this before.
So if we look at the balance sheets with the BOJ and the commercial banks, correct me if I'm wrong, but what you're proposing is that the BOJ would buy some of the toxic assets from the commercial banks. So then it would free up their balance sheet to go into the real economy and create these loans to therefore give entrepreneurs the capital they need to create more goods and services and to grow the economy in a healthy way.
That's a very, very, very neat way of putting it. Now, that is actually one important part and one of the first policies that should be taken of quantitative easing. Is not the whole story. I mean, essentially, quantitative easing refers to this expansion of credit creation in the real economy, whereby new purchasing power is created through the banking system that is then used to fund investment, investment in the production of goods and services that add value and that also implement new technologies that increase productivity and so on. And that's the goal. Now, there's different ways of getting there, and one important way of getting there is to reduce the risk aversion of banks, because the banks were quite risk averse by that time due to the incipient bad debts that they've been piling up. And of course, they were not yet fully declared, so a lot of people weren't really aware it was going to happen. But since '94, I had estimates of the total amount of bank loans that were going to turn sour, and it was around 25% of bank balance sheets, which is of course enough to close down the banking system because they don't have that much capital. The figure was for years considered far too large. By the end of the decades and the early following decade, people were saying, oh, this is too small. But with hindsight, we know it was a fairly accurate figure, which was very easy to calculate. I simply looked at the 1980s, bank credit creation for non-GDP transactions, which is for asset purchases, bank lending for the real estate sector, for construction companies, and for non-bank financial institutions. And look at the increase from roughly 1986 onwards and assume that it's going to turn sour. And there you've got your figure. So that was quite an accurate estimate. But based on that, it was clear to me that the banks, no matter what you tell them, will become very risk averse because they know themselves internally, we've got a big problem coming up here. And as a result, they just wouldn't increase bank lending.
That's if you didn't take the toxic assets off the balance sheets.
And that's exactly. So what you then need to do is, well, let's get rid of this stuff ASAP. And of course, there's different ways you can do that. There's expensive ways. These are the ways that are usually inevitably chosen. The expensive ways to use taxpayers' money, get the government to somehow bail out the banks or get rid of the toxic assets, or get the government to take over banks, even as they've done in the UK. I mean, all these are very, very expensive methods, when actually there is a zero-cost method available to do this.
Yeah, the central bank
This has always stunned me so much that, here we have a zero-cost method, no cost to society. We just get rid of this problem. People misunderstand. They think it's a new problem, and somehow it has to hurt at this new stage, and otherwise, there's something missing. We're missing something. Actually, no. The problem was already in the 80s, and you have a huge resource misallocation that took place when banks expanded extended credit, and therefore created new money for the purchase of existing assets. That is always unsustainable and creates problems, and it created huge problems. So we've had these problems. Now, how do we get rid of them and solve them? Well, let's not add new problems like, let's get the government to pay for this. Let's get government indebtedness blown out of proportion, have huge national debt now. Well, you're creating new problems on top of the old problems. Instead, we can just have a clean cut here. Okay, that's it. We've had enough of these problems. We get rid of these non-performing assets in the banking system through a method that has zero costs. And that can be done if the central bank purchases these assets at face value, moves it onto its own balance sheet, and the story ends there. Why? What happens? Well, the banks clearly, as we see immediately, will be completely recapitalized, well, they'll be so liquid, they won't have to use their capital, and therefore their capital base will remain strong. When you have suddenly a hole on the asset side of your balance sheet, this has to come normally from capital, but there isn't enough capital, so the banks would be bust. But if the central bank purchases those non-performing assets at face value, then instead you have liquid assets, central bank, credits at the central bank. So you've got a super strong, super liquid balance sheet. And the banks will be very willing and very keen to expand bank credit again. Now you could say, well, hang on, okay, I see the benefit for the banks, but what about the central banks? Isn't the central bank holding the bag now, and the central bank will suffer huge losses? So let's say the central bank purchases those non-performing assets at 100, and they're only worth 20. There's usually some residual value. I mean, there's rights, property rights, the collateral, whatever. So it is true that you could represent this transaction on the central bank balance sheet as a transaction that results in a loss of 80. You purchase something for 100 that's worth 20. But there's no rational reason to wish to do so.
Yeah, they don't have to use market-to-market accounting.
They don't have to mark-to-market, number one. And number two, accounts should reflect reality as much as possible. And the fact is, central banks are special entities. The cost of acquiring these non-performing assets is not actually 100. You can argue the cost is 0.
It's absolutely 0. It's just keystrokes.
Exactly. So, therefore, what is the real gain to central banks, or the real loss? Well, it's not a loss of 80, it's a gain of 20. Yeah. They now have a profit of 20 because they have assets worth 20, and it didn't cost them anything.
Right.
That's reality. Since that's reality, and accounting should reflect reality as much as possible, clearly it makes no sense to book a loss of 80 when there is no real loss of 80. So that's the reality. And now you could say, okay, still, yeah, I get the logic, but surely that's so radical. No central bank has ever done that. Oh, hang on. Central banks have done this. They know how to do this. But in particular, they know, there's a banking crisis coming. If we don't want to get this banking crisis to turn into big economic crisis and recession, they know what to do. Namely, purchase the non-performing assets from the banks at face value, and the story ends there, and there's no banking crisis and there's no recession. Let me give you the examples when they've done this. Look at Japan and in fact, Japan, the Bank of Japan itself has done it. Japan in 1945. So this country had just been defeated. The testing of 2 different nuclear devices has just taken place live on the population of Japan, the Christian population in Hiroshima and Nagasaki, the 2 major Christian cities. And of course, the argument was famously, well, to end the war, we needed this. Be that as it may, certainly for Hiroshima. For Nagasaki, a week later, there was no such rationale that applied, particularly dropping that bomb at 11 o'clock on a Sunday when the service was about to start, straight onto the cathedral in Nagasaki. Anyway, the cities were subjected to the incendiary bombs, and they're mostly wooden houses, so there's not much left. So pretty, destroyed country. Okay. And of course, the banking system was in not a good state, as you can imagine. Why? Well, in the previous decade, the banks had been under guidance of the munitions ministry and the central bank, being forced to extend credit to 2 destinations: the government, Greater East Asian Prosperity Bonds, war bonds, which didn't have much value in 1945. You could get them in flea markets. They had no value anymore of a country just defeated. And secondly, forced loans to the munitions industry. Now, a lot of these companies were not even in Japan anymore. Most people forget that how drastically the Japanese geography changed in 1945. What previously was Japan had become a new nation, Korea. Korea, before 1945, for half a century, was literally part of Japan, just like Ireland was part of the United Kingdom until 1920, right? And so, of course, in fact, North Korea, let me put it this way, the northern part of Korea was the most industrialized area under Japanese control, not on the main islands. Very industrialized area, and lots of Japanese companies were active there and had received, and also Korean companies, and had received loans from Japan, from Japanese banks. Well, you can forget about getting any of those loans back, of course, in 1945. They weren't even in Japan anymore. And so that was huge non-performing loans. Then, of course, there was the whole issue of Manchuria, which was a state established in 1931, where the last Chinese emperor, who was Manchurian, was made emperor of Manchuria by the Japanese, married into the Japanese imperial family. So, you know, the Chinese imperial family has descendants, but they're in Japan. It's interesting anecdotes. If you watch that movie, you know, The Last Emperor, you'll see some of the stories surrounding that. It's quite well done. Anyway, so Manchuria was, you know, was a large area. That was when the Japanese got in 1931. It was rural, completely rural, you know, producing soybeans and things like that. But the Japanese decided to try a new economic model that they'd found from their reading of German economics. And they decided, well, let's give this a try. And they did, to very good effect. 10 years later, Manchuria had become the most industrialized area in the whole of Asia, second only to Japan. And lots of Japanese companies were active there. Nissan used to be called Mangyo, which is the Manchurian industrial conglomerate, and so on. Now, Japanese banks, of course, were lending large scale. 1945, none of that could be expected to be repaid, and of course it wasn't. So that's the other part of the Japanese bank's balance sheet, lending to munitions companies and companies in the war effort, and companies that are, you know, not even in Japan anymore. So that was almost entirely also non-performing. So essentially, non-performing assets were not just 25% of assets as in the early 90s. They were close to 100% non-performing assets. Now that's a really bad situation. Although in some ways it doesn't even matter. And once you're beyond 10% non-performing assets, you know, it doesn't matter. So the story then was the Bank of Japan looked at all this vast devastation, the completely annihilated banking system as well, and decided, is this a good moment to have a banking crisis now and have a recession, you know, and the Great Depression on top of all the devastation that's already taken place? Maybe not. Maybe not. Maybe if there is a way to avoid a banking crisis and a recession, let's go for it. And of course, there was a way. So the Bank of Japan, put simply, slightly simplified, but essentially purchased the non-performing assets from the banks, not quite at face value, but significantly above market value, so much is sure. The banking system was therefore suddenly very strong and very liquid again. And while in the 90s, the much smaller amount of non-performing assets in the banking system created a 20-year recession, after 1945, with much larger amounts of non-performing assets, close to 100% of bank balance sheets. You know how long the recession was? Probably only 1 year. And then bank credit was booming again, and there was no looking back. This was the beginning of the high growth era, double-digit economic growth. So the Bank of Japan knows exactly what to do. Now, it's not the only central bank, of course. The first central bank that did this trick was, as far as I could find, the Bank of England. Who else? When in August 1914, the United Kingdom of Great Britain and Ireland declared war on Germany and her allies, the Austrian-Hungarian Empire and the Ottoman Empire. I mean, that was quite a declaration of war, so it was clear it's going to be a major European war. The next day, the bankers came and knocked on the door of the government, senior officials, and the central bank, and they said, sorry, we have a problem. Yes, sir, what's the problem? We're bust. Why? We've got a war to fight. I mean, it's not a time to go bust. What's happening? Well, you just declared war on all of these trading partners. And because, of course, the number one market for anything to do with money, stock markets, FX, and of course, credit and loans and international lending, bills of trades, bills of exchange, international credit. Number one location was London. Of course, even the deals between Germany and Hungary and Ottoman Empire, would often go through London. So British banks were holding what since August 1914 was then declared to be enemy paper that was considered irredeemable, and therefore that's a non-performing asset. Right. And quite a few banks therefore were bust. So the Bank of England looked at this and thought, okay, we just declared war on Germany, Austria-Hungary, Ottoman Empire. Maybe not a good moment to have a banking crisis and a long recession. So shall we not have one? Okay, let's not have one. Well, we'll just purchase all this paper at face value and we can forget about it. And that's what happened.
If we do that now, today, what would be the risk of moral hazard? Because if I'm the bank and I just basically get bailed out, I take all this risk and the Fed buys the bad debts off my balance sheet. I'd say, well, why not just do this again? I mean, they're not going to let me go bust. So why not just take
exactly. Well, there's two answers to this. Let's take the one that's most relevant first, and that is what actually happened in 2008 when a lot of banks went bankrupt. Apart from Lehman Brothers, which wasn't even a bank, the banks got bailed out. And therefore, nobody cared about moral hazard. That's the reality. That's the revealed preference of the policymakers and central bankers. They didn't care about moral hazard. But they chose, in almost all countries, the most expensive way of doing this bailout, namely using taxpayers' money.
Okay, so the point is you're going to have moral hazard regardless. So you might as well do it the next way.
Exactly. Now, that's one answer. The other answer is, actually, we don't need to have moral hazard. We can also avoid it. And that is simply done. And it's just a little added, tweak there. We can simply do it by using the enormous power that the central bank has that moment when it says, okay, guys, bring it on. We're going to buy all this paper. Wow, fantastic. Thank you very much. In that moment, the central bank can say, oh, by the way, we have a little request here for you guys. For instance, the request could be, and of course, it's more than a request. From now on, all bank credit has to be for transactions that contribute to GDP. And that's always been my recommended policy guideline. In other words, only bank credit for GDP transactions are allowed, and bank credit to purchase existing assets is simply not allowed. And also banks lending to specialists that do such lending are also not allowed. Then you would not get asset bubbles and you would not get banking crises. We could talk about this a bit later, but just perhaps to complete that thought, some people will say, well, hang on, that means banks are also not lending for mortgages. What about young families? They need a house. Shouldn't they get a bank loan?
Yeah. Or lending in
well, actually, no, they shouldn't get a bank loan. They should get a loan. Yes, agreed. They should get a loan. But why a bank loan? Because banks are special. And this is the trouble nowadays, that nobody even understands what makes banks special. And maybe we can talk about this, but banks are special. And that's why we have to think about when and how we use bank credit. And so in a nutshell, the proposal would be those who want a mortgage, they should get the mortgage from specialist mortgage providers that are non-bank financial institutions, don't have the power to create credit, and therefore cannot create asset bubbles and banking crises. And you can set them up. They can fund themselves from bonds that banks are not allowed to purchase, but non-bank players can invest in them. So then, in other words, what you do, you ensure, for example, you ensure that such mortgage loans are funded with existing money, and then you can't create bubbles with that. The trouble is when the banks fund asset purchases, because whenever a bank gives a loan, it's always money creation.
Right.
But that money creation should really be reserved for productive transactions only, which is when you implement new technology, new business ideas, you add value, business investment that increases productivity, that sort of thing, because then you get more goods and services, higher quality things, while you also get more money, but both are in balance, and then you don't even get inflation. But as soon as you create money, while you don't create new goods and services and add value, and that, I'm afraid, includes asset purchases, because they don't add value, we'll come to that. As soon as you do that, you get asset inflation, you get consumer price inflation, you get unsustainable developments, which will eventually cause trouble. So that's the story. And there was one exception to what I said earlier. There was one central bank in 2008 that did take my advice, which was my advice from Japan from the 90s. There was one guy, one academic. There's quite a few academics that took part in this debate on Japan in the 90s. There was Joe Stiglitz, but there was also somebody called Ben Bernanke from Yale, I believe. And Princeton, I think. Okay, you know better than me. And he participated in this debate, and he seemed to listen to what I was saying, that you just need to purchase the non-performing assets from the banks at face value through the central bank and make sure bank credit expands again. Because the Federal Reserve in 2008 was the only central bank, as far as I could tell, that did just that. It purchased non-performing assets from the banks, and it worked like magic. A few years later, 2 years later, bank credit was booming again, 4, 5, 6% bank credit growth. And therefore, the fastest recovery after the 2008 setback. Of course, there's countries that never had a recession because their banking system consists of 80% community banks that never engaged in the speculation. That's Germany. So they never even had a recession. But that's a different story. Of those countries that were affected by the 2008 crisis, the Fed, the US was the only one, thanks to the Fed policies, of getting out very quickly through implementing that part of QE. Now, interestingly, Bernanke then, when he gave a speech in January 2009 in London at the LSE, my alma mater, he made the point of saying, this is not QE what I'm doing, because this Japanese QE is not working. And the thing is, the Japanese, and actually we haven't explained this yet. So when I put out we have to slightly go back now to Japan. My proposal was 94, 95. For years, the Bank of Japan said, this is nonsense. We don't need this new monetary policy. It's going to be fine by lowering rates. Right. They lowered rates. And this is going to work. And, it's not quite working just yet. I will just wait a little bit. And then why don't we lower rates a little bit further? And, ultimately it's going to work, because I kept lowering rates. And then it didn't work. So they had a new brilliant idea. We've lowered rates now 7, 8 times. It's not working. Here's a new idea. Let's lower rates. So they kept doing this for a whole decade. Okay. And then by 2000, I think it was getting too embarrassing. And then one member on their board of the monetary policy board was saying, well, I heard this QE. We should try QE, quantitative easing. Let's do that. And they were in a quandary because they'd already published a lot of studies arguing, using fancy theoretical mathematical models that are, completely covering completely different planets in some different universe, but not planet Earth, but you know the stuff I'm talking about. And they concluded with these articles that, well, QE wouldn't work. And so they were in this quandary, and they then decided, okay, why don't we just try the QE, but we can prove that it doesn't work. And so that's what they did in March 2001. The Bank of Japan announced, okay, we're going to do this QE, but it's not going to work. It's not going to work, they said. But we'll try it just to, indulge in these crazy guys calling for QE. But what they did was not QE. What they did was plain old-fashioned monetarism.
Yeah, they just added bank reserves to the accounts, right? They didn't take the bad.
That's it. You got it precisely.
Yeah.
And what good does it do the economy if the banks have more reserves at the central bank if nothing else changes? That's all you're doing. Well, that's not going to be helpful. And so as a result, it didn't really have much of an impact. And so in 2006, so 5 years later, they announced, well, we've tried it. It didn't work. So we're going to abolish it now. And therefore, it is actually surprising that only 2 years later, in Europe and America, central banks would suddenly say, "Oh, we're going to do QE now," when the Japanese had actually concluded, well, officially at least, it doesn't work. Well, the reason why I think it was adopted in the West was because of Ben Bernanke, and he was doing the real QE, not the fake QE. And so in his speech in January 2009 at the LSE, he was making that point. What the Japanese did was the fake QE. I'm paraphrasing, he didn't put it in those terms. And that didn't work. But what I'm doing is different. It's the real stuff. It's about credit. And he said, and we should really call it credit easing, which is closer to my original definition of, expanding credit creation. And that one is going to work. And, of course,
the mistake he made, Richard, correct me if I'm wrong, is he didn't add that stipulation in for the banks that they needed to lend for productive purposes. So what they do is they lend to hedge funds and other financial institutions, and they look around and say, risk reward, let's just go in the stock market because we got the Fed put. Exactly.
That was, that's what happened. And so unfortunately, while the policy was better in the US in general because it was more effective, it wasn't implemented in the optimal way and essentially just benefited the financial sector again. And so you're just creating another asset bubble and increasing inequality and all those problems, while still not really funding the real economy. Fortunately, of course, the US has a lot of small banks, community banks lending to small firms, and that backbone has remained strong. Without that, it would have been a huge disaster. But the bias towards big banks lending for big financial speculators and asset markets had become bigger. And that, of course, is the Achilles heel of the US financial system.
Yeah. So what we have now, and I've given this a lot of thought, and I've heard you say that before, the commercial banks are responsible for creating about 97% of the, we'll call it dollars or euros, basically the currency units that are on the balance sheet of non-bank entities in the real economy. That's kind of how I describe it. But now what we have is the government here in the United States running, let's say, a $4 to $5 trillion deficit. And a lot of those bonds end up on the balance sheet of the central bank, the Fed, which, to your point, doesn't take money or dollars out of the system to buy those bonds. They just create new bank reserves that are denominated in dollars. So my point is, if the Fed is monetizing the debt, when those checks go out of the TGA and people deposit those create new deposits or dollar-denominated liabilities in the commercial banking system. So is that money creation?
Yes, it is. It is, exactly. So what's been happening, particularly since April last year, is a different kind of QE, and there's a big difference. And the difference, I always measure credit creation of the banking system and the central bank, and use that in my Global Liquidity Watch report to analyze and forecast equity, bond, and FX markets in 38 countries. And last year was just amazing. Everything in most countries, they were all doing the same thing. So you see the degree of coordination, well, we saw that with the so-called COVID policies as well, is quite extraordinary. And they'd all switched the QE. So the big difference to QE in 2008 and 2020 was that they'd all switched to now aggressively expanding bank credit creation. So that, since May, June last year, I've been warning of the inflationary effect this is going to have. It was inevitable. So it is a different policy, and the goal has been to really now boost credit creation, boost spending, and push up prices. Of course, the question is, how long is this going to last, and where will this end? Initially, I was thinking, well, if they kept going at that extraordinary pace that they had in April, May, June last year, then I would have said,
spending is what you're referring to, the government deficit spending. You're referring to the government.
I am talking about bank credit creation. Bank credit creation. That is, so essentially what happens is the central bank implemented QE in the form of forcing the banks to expand credit creation.
Through the PPP loans.
by, well, that's one way, the guarantees, government guarantees, and exactly, but also by purchasing, essentially by forcing the banks to expand the money creation and create new deposits in the banking system. The central bank can do that, and that's what they did. Whereas they didn't do that at all in 2008. And of course, the result, is increased spending, increased demand, and inflation. And the increase was so extraordinary that had that continued at that pace, then we would have talked about hyperinflation starting maybe later this year. But we're not there. Fortunately, they reduced this pace drastically. Although this hyperinflation scenario, I don't think is completely off the table.
Yeah.
Inflation is now out as an issue, and I think will stay with us. But it is a policy variable. It now depends on what they're going to do next. So one has to watch this very carefully. It's certainly one of the options because we have all this debt, this national debt in so many countries. And high inflation is one way of just getting rid of that, and also ushering in a reset in the financial system. And of course, the Great Reset is in everyone's mouth, and is one of the things that certainly certain players are aiming for on a global scale, with a new monetary system centered on currencies that are not really currencies, but are really control tools.
Yeah, like
surveillance and control tools, the so-called, they call it
digital SDR.
CBDC. SDRs or central bank digital currencies, which are all misnomers really, because when you talk about CBD, central bank digital currencies, CBDCs, then it suggests like it's something new. But of course, we've had BDCs, bank digital currencies, for decades. That's the money we're using, is actually bank digital currency.
Sure.
So really what's happening is central banks, which are bank regulators, are now saying that, well, they're not saying it, that what they're preparing to do is they're about to step into the arena, despite being bank regulators. They now want to compete against the banks,
right,
by offering retail accounts to the public.
That's
this is quite extraordinary, quite extraordinary. And of course, to hide this, they call it something geeky, like central bank digital currencies.
Yeah, it's basically all the entities in the private sector, the individuals and the businesses have an account now with the Fed. So the Fed can turn those bank reserves in a legal tender, or the people can actually spend bank reserves in the real economy, where right now there's that transfer mechanism of the commercial banks. I want to go back just so I'm clear here. Let's just assume for a moment that commercial bank credit expansion was flat. And let's say the government came out and spent $1 trillion. So in order to get the money in the TGA, which is the liability of the Fed, they had to sell those bonds. Those bonds were not sold to the general public. So the dollars did not come out of the private sector to begin with. Let's just assume that those bonds were sold directly to the Federal Reserve. So those go onto the asset side of the Federal Reserve's balance sheet. They create the bank reserves out of nothing. That's a liability that goes into the TGA. And then let's say Janet Yellen takes that $1 trillion and sends out checks to, let's say, stimulus checks to individuals. They deposit them into Wells Fargo, Bank of America, Chase. So now the banking system has $1 trillion in additional dollar-denominated liabilities. And then the offsetting asset would be the TGA, or the Fed really, transferring that trillion in bank reserves from the TGA onto the reserve accounts that Wells Fargo, B of A, or Chase has with the Fed. So the way I see it, that would create an additional $1 trillion circulating in the real economy, but yet bank credit expansion would have been flat. Am I understanding that correctly?
Yes, so that is a separate mechanism to the one I mentioned earlier.
Okay.
That's right. That's also possible. And in fact, that is, I think, the reason why this is encouraged has partly to do with these CBDCs, because
right,
increasingly what we see is, the central bank stepping out and becoming like a normal bank that's dealing with the public.
Right.
This is really what's happening. And of course, when you have the bank regulator that can easily make life difficult for banks, obviously, and they have been over the last decade or so, becomes a bank, a player competing against the others. That's not a level playing field. What's going to happen is the banks will start to disappear. They'll be forced to merge. And of course, this has happened in the last 15 years already because of increased regulatory pressures and burdens and costs. And on the other hand, also the interest rate policies, zero and negative interest rate policies, as the ECB has been pursuing, are killing banks. Right. So they are forced to merge because traditional bank lending, with a flat yield curve or an inverted yield curve just doesn't make sense. Only the speculative lending then makes sense.
Yeah, right.
And so you get fewer banks, and banks are dying. And this is what's happened in the US and the Eurozone. In the Eurozone, since the ECB started business, 5,000 banks have disappeared.
Yeah,
and a similar figure in the US.
And if they go back to a central bank digital currency where Jerome Powell can issue auto loans and mortgages, let's say, how do you compete? How do you compete with a bank that, to your earlier point, can have negative equity?
Well, exactly. You can't.
Yeah, so
you can't compete. So really, what we're heading for is the Soviet system. The Soviet Union had, certainly during a key period in its history, had only one bank. Gosbank.
Stalinist, I want to be clear, Stalinist Russia. I've heard you talk about this, and this is actually where I wanted to take the conversation next.
That's right. Under Stalinism, because Stalinism is about total control and centralized totalitarian power, right, and control over people. In that system, what you want to have is just one central bank that controls all financial, transactions essentially. And of course, in those days, Joe Stalin had very crude methods available to him. Nowadays, it's much more fun to be a totalitarian dictator, because you can actually use high tech to fine tune your dictatorship.
Right.
And with central bank digital currency, it's not really money. It's not really a currency. It's a control tool. You can switch it on and off completely selectively, not just by person, but also by the type of shopping they're doing. And maybe this product is okay, but not that product. Will be tailored to you for your benefit, probably using AI or maybe something else. But it will all happen. That's the trouble, and that's why we need to be very much aware of these developments and try to stop them.
Yeah, I think because the central banks can have negative equity, therefore they can loan to people based on anything they want. They don't necessarily have to consider their credit worthiness. I'm concerned that in the future, we'll see most of the lending being based on a social score instead of a credit score. Do you have any thoughts on that?
Well, yes. That's the system that we have to some extent in China in some version. Companies in particular being evaluated in this way in China. And I suppose the controllers and central planners in Europe and America have been very jealous of China. So, they look there and say, oh, we wish we could do this. Well, how can we engineer for this to be done here too? And so, that's what they'd love to introduce. But all of these things should be done out in the open. They should be discussed. There should be democratic debates and then votes on this. Like, is this what we want? Do we want a Stalinist system? Yes or no? Let's have a vote on it. But that's not happening. And that's the devious thing, the sinister thing.
And does the centralizing go one step further with a digital SDR? Because I've listened to the IMF and the World Economic Forum and how they're pushing for the SDR to have to be the global reserve asset on central banks' balance sheets instead of gold or dollars or something else. So now you're dealing with at least with the central bank digital currency, you've got competing central banks. But if you go to that system, then there's just one group and they're not elected. So how do you see that
Well, I think it's the natural corollary. Once you agree to central bank digital currencies, then it's a small step to say, well, let's link them all up in some way.
Yeah.
And then, SDR would be one way to do that. They could call it something else, or, or use the BIS instead of the IMF. It almost doesn't matter. It's just a natural step that follows once you agree to this totalitarian control with central bank current accounts that are called CBDC.
I'm by no means a Bitcoin maximalist, but I do really love the philosophy behind Bitcoin and sound money and decentralization. So I know one of the arguments for Bitcoin from the people who really understand it is that it takes the money system out of the government and out of the commercial banking system, because everyone can carry it just basically on a thumb drive. So therefore, lending wouldn't be even in the control of the banks. It can be from individual to individual. So, that takes decentralization to a whole new level, going the opposite direction of a central bank digital currency. So is that one, one counter argument, or is that something where we should be, or something that we should be optimistic about if we value freedom and liberty?
In principle, yes. You are, heading in the right direction, because the centralization is the problem,
right?
And that's the trend that's being pushed, further and further centralization of power and decision making and control tools. And by the way, one more angle is this: when you have only one central bank and you have no more banks, which is the road that some are wanting to go down, there won't be any more economic growth either, because
right.
There won't be productive credit creation. I don't see the central banks engaging in that, actually. And I think that explains why at the same time we've got these stories coming up with, we don't need growth. Growth is bad for the environment. There's the whole climate story, and we need to degrowth. All these books on degrowth and zero growth and so on. Let's have a Japanese style scenario, 20 years of, forever zero growth. That's being pushed now. But actually, just briefly on that, there is no contradiction between, being environmentally sustainable and environmentally enhancing and economic growth. It's not growth that is killing the environment. That's complete nonsense. Growth is just a statistical fiction. It doesn't actually exist, So how can it harm the environment? How can something fictional harm the environment? Yeah. What harms the environment is harmful activities like pollution and so on. But you can have growth without pollution. Whereas likewise, you can have zero growth and a lot of pollution as well. So it's complete nonsense to conflate the two, right? Doesn't make sense. But anyway, but that's the agenda that's being pushed. The centralization and ultimately zero growth, and then, Hunger Games. Whereas what we should be doing is, as you say, we should do the opposite and head towards decentralization and also maintain growth. We can have very high growth. In fact, we should increase growth, because what's been happening since the 1970s is that they've pushed down growth rates in so many countries artificially, saying, it's because of aging society, fertility rates going down. These are all policy variables. They've been pushing hard to reduce fertility, with many techniques and methods. The potential growth rate has declined in America. In Europe, it's just very low, 1-2%. It's all nonsense. It's all not true. Potential growth in the US can be every year 10%. You can realize that and make it real if you have the right policies. I can certainly, put together the policies to get 10% economic growth in almost any country. And that's true in Europe as well. So what they've been doing is they've artificially been suppressing growth, and therefore we've lost enormous amounts of potential wealth, and those that have not benefited from the recent asset market booms, they could have been doing much better than they have, because we've had this artificial low growth scenario. So we should head for decentralization and maintaining high growth. Now, how can we do that? And that's why I see some limitations with Bitcoin, because it doesn't directly link to economic growth. I think, it's good to have alternative systems and decentralized systems. So that's good. By all means, use them. But we need something on top of that that gives us prosperity and the creation of new money linked to the implementation of new productive activities. And there's two things I'm proposing on this front, and one is to create local small banks. Community banks, small banks are the ones that lend to small firms. Small firms are the ones that are the biggest employer in every country, and also they're the ones that create new jobs. Now, small firms essentially get only credit from small banks, and that's what we need to set up. And that has the advantage of also being accountable organizations. If you have a small local bank, there is a chance to hold that bank to account, and the bank board and the decision makers. Any organization, human organization that gets too large becomes out of control. And even regulators can't control these big banks.
And a bank that keeps the debt on the balance sheet. Or
yes, that's right.
Balance sheet.
Exactly. And with small banks, local banks, the advantage is also that certainly if you set up a system like that, Germany has a system like that, they only lend locally.
Right.
So then a bank is forced to really think hard. We only have this district here. That's our turf. That's our area. We can only lend here. Well, what can we do? How can we help the businesses here? How can we help, even create new businesses? Bankers get very creative when you put them in this environment. They're essentially in the same boat as the small firms in their area, and then they will support them.
Yeah,
that works very well.
All the incentives are aligned.
Exactly.
In this scenario, Richard, so we're talking about the lending, productive lending, from the standpoint of the bank and having the capacity to do so. But how important are the balance sheets in the private sector that the bank, of the individuals and entities the bank could possibly lend to? So what I mean by that is if they're levered to the hilt, then even if we set up the small commercial banks, they're not going to have anyone to lend to without taking enormous amounts of risk. And then on that note, how important is the regulatory environment? Because if you had that structure in communist Russia, as an example, with no private property, then it wouldn't do any good. Or with taxes, I think that could be an issue as well. Yeah. It's like all these cross currents need to be considered.
Yes, but it's not rocket science. It's actually not very hard. I mean, the first point about who can they lend to? Well, if all the existing companies are already loaned up to the hilt, then then it will be younger companies, new companies, and they're always being created. I mean, the number of small firms is in the millions in every country, literally millions of them, and so there's never been a shortage of that. The regulatory environment is important. America has an advantage there because the small banks have their own regulator, and they don't have to meet the Basel capital adequacy rules, which makes perfect sense. Can you imagine what's been happening in Europe? In Europe, this is where we have mostly small banks, tiny banks, local banks. In Germany, 80% of the banks are these small banks, local banks, and yet the Basel rules set up by the central bankers are being applied to all of them. So the tiniest German credit union with 10 staff has to meet the same rules and requirements as Deutsche Bank with 2,000 compliance staff and writing all the regulatory reports they need to fill in. So you can imagine for the last 15 years since they introduced the new rules, Basel III and so on, have been on the way of introducing them. Well, they've suffered and they've been forced to merge. So they've been killing them by not having a separate regulator and much laxer rules that are suitable, proportionate to the size.
And at the same time, flattening the end of the curve.
Yeah, exactly. Now, the tax point is also valid. I mean, essentially, we can have, once you have the right system that delivers high growth, you can have very low tax rates. And, you almost don't need taxes because there'll be so much prosperity. The government will have so many sources of revenue. So the important thing is to create the right high growth system, which is quite possible. And then the tax question will be solved easily.
Well, let's highlight some examples, Richard, that really back up this point. So
okay.
I've heard you talk about Germany having they're an export powerhouse. And I've heard you give some statistics on that. I think that would blow people's mind. And that's a great example of how powerful those SMEs actually are on a global scale. And so if we give them capital, how that will make society richer by producing more goods and services.
Yes,
You also
exactly.
used an example of China.
Oh, yes. Yeah.
A few decades ago. So I think people would love
exactly.
to hear that.
Yeah, let's do that. Let's do exactly that. Well, which is the country that has, I think it's the largest number of billionaires per capita of the population? And I think it's Germany. It's certainly one of the ones which the largest number. I think it's the ones with the largest number per capita of billionaires. And these are all owners of former SMEs that became so successful, global exporters, that of course, it's 100% owned by the families, all small family businesses. That's how you become a billionaire, So why are these German small firms, family businesses, so successful? Well, first of all, let me illustrate the success. Germany has a lot of exports. For many years, Germany had more exports in total size than China, a country with a population that's 30 times larger than Germany. So that's quite a success. But a huge part of those exports are from tiny, unknown, small firms, family businesses.
Right.
How is that possible? SMEs, small and medium-sized enterprises. They account for such a huge chunk of German exports. It's mind-blowing. Now, somebody studied this, and essentially what they did is they looked at the most successful German small firms, SMEs, and they defined the success as being the number one player in their market niche, or number two or number three. So the top three, like in the Olympics, gold, silver, bronze. So if you have global market share, number 1, 2, or 3, then you're a champion. And because you're a small firm, they only did this for SMEs, small and medium-sized enterprises. As a result, there's no brand recognition. These are unknown names. So they call this hidden champions. So that's the definition of hidden champions. And then they did an international comparison. So how many hidden champions are there in each country?
Right.
Now, America is one of the strong players in this. There's 320 hidden champions in America, which is very good. It's the second highest figure in the world. The highest is Germany, which has 1,500, which is head and shoulder above anyone else. If you look at the graph, everyone else is around 50, 60, or less, something like that. And how's that possible? It's because of the banking system. That's also why America is doing not so badly on this count, because it has a lot of small local banks, community banks. In Germany, we have a much larger amount of community banks per capita, and 80% of banks are local community banks in Germany, and they only lend locally. So they know their local players, their local small firms. When there's a new technology, and this is really what it's about when we look at productivity, and productivity simply is being able to implement the latest technologies. You don't have to invent them. You just need to implement and adapt them for your commercial purposes. And of course, this is also done by specialists, but every small firm therefore has, they get offers like, oh, we can upgrade this now to the latest technology. Well, what's stopping them? Money, of course. It's expensive to upgrade to the latest technology in your process is expensive. But in Germany, they just go to their bank, they explain, look, this is the latest technology. We want to stay champion, number 1, 2 market share in the world. We've got to constantly upgrade. And the bank looks at it and says, okay, here's the loan, we'll do it. And that works best in Germany. As a result, they are most productive and most successful, and they have the largest number of hidden champions.
And China. And
okay, so there's China. Now, China is great because earlier we talked about the Soviet Union. And of course, the Chinese system was originally based, under Mao, Chairman Mao, was based on the Soviet Union. It was a Soviet-style system. Now, after him, essentially by 1978, a new leader came to power called Deng Xiaoping. And he was a very smart guy. One thing is he hated ideologies and just, empty words. He was interested in reality and in delivering results. So he was a very pragmatic guy. Now he looked around and he decided, well, the Soviet model isn't really that successful, let's face it. But I look across the water here, and I see Japan is phenomenally successful. By 78, you know, Japan was really beginning to challenge the US.
Right.
And how did they do that? Well, he knew how to find out about that. You know, if you want to find out secrets in Japan, just go to Japan. You meet people, you have lunch, you have dinner. Make sure there's a bit of sake in the game. In Deng Xiaoping's case, I think there was also some motai being drunk when he visited Japan in 1978. And he found out, because they will always tell you the truth in Japan, but only informally, off the record, over dinner. And they told him, hey, we've got these, you know, literally thousands of banks, small banks, local banks, regional banks, secondary regional banks, credit unions, you know, whatever, savings banks. They lend to small firms. That's how we do it. They're very productive. We generate massive growth. That's how we get 15% economic growth. And the central bank guides this by making sure the banks don't lend to unproductive purposes for consumption or for frivolous stuff or for asset purchases. The central bank has intervention where it just simply checks the bank lending and says, no, you can't do the speculative lending, financial asset lending. No, it has to be productive business investment lending. Okay, right. And they called this window guidance, by the way. So Deng Xiaoping went back and told his people, this is how we're going to do it. I see Japan successful, Germany's doing the same, and also the US, although there's no, you know, as we know, not much of the guidance happening, but the structure of the banking system is also highly diversified, thousands of small banks. Let's have that. And so he departed from the Soviet monobank model.
Right.
And he created, under his command, you know, they created thousands and thousands and thousands of banks. At the moment, the country with the second largest number of banks in the world is China, after the US. And what was the result? Well, the rest is history. You know, since he did that, economic growth really took off. We had 4 decades of double-digit economic growth, and more people were lifted out of poverty than anywhere else in any time before in history. So that was highly successful, and it's due to creating many, many banks, small banks, local banks, community banks, that lend to small firms. So it works very well. And I think that's what we need to do. Now, there is one way in which we can, you know, push for this decentralization and also use the latest technologies in the sort of cryptocurrency world. And this is something I'm looking at with some of my colleagues. And essentially what we're working on doing is, because, you know, I'm engaged in setting up community banks, Hampshire Community Bank, Norfolk Community Bank, other community banks. Also in other countries, we're looking at this, in continental Europe and beyond. And the idea is we're going to issue tokens for people to participate in this and also to help, you know, get this going. And these are essentially governance tokens where you can, you know, you can make a decision for an autonomous, you know, entity, DAO, and you can essentially then get a say over certain types of banks that you want to see being created. One could even pull it down to the level of, you know, what types of sectors should receive loans and so on. So, you know, essentially people would get some voting power and decision-making power in this, and be involved, you know, by backing these tokens. But the idea is essentially to set up a whole lot of these banks.
Right.
And that puts power back into the hands of the local communities, you know, and the money creation power is given back to the people to whom it belongs.
Yeah, that's right. That's the key. So for those people who really value, you know, freedom, liberty, but also want to see the standard of living increase for society at large, especially for the poor and middle class, this is something that we all need to be thinking about. We all need to stand up for. But I also think we need to be cognizant of the push towards this mono bank, as you described it, because we do have a lot of the central planners, a lot of the politicians, the IMF, the World Economic Forum, that are pushing in this direction. So we need to combat that by doing the opposite and taking this DeFi approach with these smaller community banks that where the incentive structure is aligned.
Exactly. That's right. Yeah.
All right, Richard, I think I kept you a little long, so I really appreciate your time. I mean, this is a fantastic conversation. I could literally talk to you for hours on end. So
Let's do it again. Let's do it again.
Yeah, I can't wait to do it again. But for my viewers and listeners who want to find out more about what you do or more about your projects with these banks, where can they go?
Well, one website is local-first.org.uk. Local First is a community interest company, a social enterprise that sets up community banks, and it is involved in various community bank projects, established banks. There's also some other projects, but I mean, I can be reached on my website, professorwerner.org. We're also looking at creating another type of specialized bank. And as I said, the token, I think, is quite an exciting development, because essentially there are ways to let people participate in the profits from coming from that as well, which, is another interesting angle.
Absolutely. All right, Professor, again, I appreciate your time, and I can't wait to have another conversation.
Thanks very much. Thanks for having me. Thank you. Bye-bye.
Hi, guys. I'd like to invite each and every one of you to the next Rebel Capitalist live event. If you are a fan of the Rebel Capitalist show, I guarantee you will love the live event. The next one is Houston, where you can meet and listen to speakers, all your favorites from the Rebel Capitalist show. People such as Dr. Ron Paul, Chris Cole, Lynn Alden, just to name a few. If you want to check out the rest of the speaker list and find out how you can attend, we'll put a link in the description below, or you can just go to rebelcapitalistlive.com. This is an event where you can learn to build wealth and thrive in a world of out-of-control central banks and big governments. But it's not just about building wealth. It's about increasing your freedom and networking with like-minded individuals, fellow rebel capitalists. It's an amazing event. I know you'll absolutely love it. Check out rebelcapitalistlive.com, and I will see you in Houston.